the people of sake actually brought me into sake.
Back in 1988, this place was actually in Ginza on the main drag.
At first it was kind of soy sauce, it was miso.
To the point where it actually changed my life.
New Year's Day 1989.
Not just sake as a beverage, but all the culture and history.
So here we are once again. Welcome back to Sake on Air, the bi-weekly podcast broadcasting here from the Sake and Shochu Information Center here in Tokyo. Sharing the world and the love of sake and all the stories and things that are happening in Japan and connecting to the rest of the world. My name is Justin Potts, and today with me I have...
Christopher Hughes.
My name is Sebastien Lemoine.
Excellent. And so with this team of three today, we're going to look at the state of the sake industry, which is a massive topic, and which is why for today we're going to be focusing on the sake industry of Japan. And in doing that, I said there's going to be a number of categories, a number of things that we're going to discuss when we get into there. We'll be looking at, first, kind of just general industry numbers. What is the sake doing? What are the producers doing? Where is sake moving throughout this country, and how? We're going to kind of break down some of those numbers for you. Then we'll sort of look at production. We'll look at consumption. Who is partaking in this lovely beverage? We're going to look a little bit at the agricultural side. We'll try and dive into that a little bit without going too deep down that rabbit hole, because I have a feeling we'll probably do a special episode on that one of these days. It definitely deserves a topic all its own, but we'll go into a little bit of background information there. There's a chance that we could be dipping into a few technical terms, a bit of information that might require a bit of context for why should I care or what does that mean. We'll do our best to provide that along the way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, for those things that we can't maybe get into thoroughly enough, maybe in the show notes afterward, we can provide some links with some information or some articles and things like that,
doing it, isn't it? Yeah.
so that people can get additional information. Who are
Maybe
interested.
on the site.
Yeah.
Exactly. Anyway, before we delve into that, however, I'm going to open a bottle of sake.
Oh, we get to drink sake.
Because it seems like the right thing to do. It seems like it would be in everyone's best interest. Because this is indeed, it is Hiyaoroshi season, or Akiagari season. Would one of you gentlemen like to explain to our...
I'll start off and Sebastien kind of jump in. And
Go for it.
I personally feel, first of all, there are 4 seasons for sake. Generally, sake is best enjoyed young, but
There are exceptions.
There are a lot of exceptions. In fact, we should say for everything that we tell you on this podcast, there are a myriad of exceptions. This is something that John always says, right? So the John disclaimer, basically, the John Gauntner disclaimer is there are exceptions for everything. But you want to open the bottle and get the sound on there. So I'm going to shut up for a sec.
Hold on.
So
let's see
that
if
explanation.
any audio comes through here. Hold on. Let's see. That was very, very anticlimactic.
Yeah.
We'll have to dub something in there. I'll have to bring something with a bit more pop next time.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
But yeah, so Akiagari is what? Tell me about what are
Well, so, okay, if we go all the way back to kind of the beginnings of sake history, originally, brewers didn't really age sake because, it didn't really develop in a good way. And that was to do with the structure of sake. If you don't pasteurize sake, it's quite unstable. And in the olden days, they didn't have refrigerators, of course. They didn't have refrigeration. So they couldn't really store the sake even after they'd, aged it. So most breweries, as soon as they produced the sake, they just wanted to get it out the door. And basically, if when you tried to age the sake, it went in a negative direction, you called it aki ochi. And if it developed in a positive direction, you literally called it aki agari, which literally means...
What's aki?
Aki is autumn, Japanese for autumn, and agari literally means kind of going up. You have a better translation than that?
Nope.
I'm supposed to be good at Japanese. Well, basically the flavor is elevated as opposed to being, the opposite of elevated. And so breweries, as they started to develop their brewing skills and as refrigeration came in, breweries started to try and mature the sake more and more. And they had better results as time went along. So Akiagari is basically the successful version of trying to mature sake throughout the summer months. So as I said at the beginning, there are 4 It's basically 4 seasons for sake: winter, spring, summer, and autumn. And of course, the sake is freshly brewed in the winter, released in the spring. And then from the spring, it kind of goes through this maturation period. It's normally pasteurized once before they put it into storage. And then at the end, in the autumn, when they're released in the autumn as akiagari or hiya-oroshi, I'm getting to the bit about hiya-oroshi, basically they don't pasteurize it a second time. And by not pasteurizing it a second time, the sake is incredibly unstable, theoretically, okay? So if you want to ship the sake, you have to make sure that the outside temperature is the same as the storage inside the brewery. So the ambient temperature matches storage in the brewery. And that is the literal meaning of hiya-oroshi, to basically ship the sake at a cool temperature.
Technically it works, but what's really important is that after some time you need something to rejoice about and get people drink sake or more sake. And hiya-oroshi is the occasion of a number of events and sake proposals in bars and restaurants to it's an opportunity for a bar or a restaurant to change its lineup.
Yep.
From the light summer sake to a sake with a bit more depth. And again, it's very much consistent with what's happening on the food side, because as we move into autumn, the ingredients are changing. We see some seasonal fish coming on the table, like
Samba,
yeah, absolutely.
Pacific Saudi,
the mushroom are now part of the feast, and you need a slightly different sake to pair with that. So
a milder sake, and sake really does kind of come full circle throughout that maturation through the summer months. It kind of develops as an adult. If you imagine sake being a child at the beginning and not being fully developed and fully matured, autumn is basically where the flavor profile has come full circle. And I really do think it's a lot milder. And
I would go out on a limb to say some of the best food, if not the best food of the year, is in autumn.
Yep.
And so with those cooling temperatures, and with the release of the hiya-oroshi or the akiagari, while it in and of itself is delicious, it's just a really nice time to be here.
Yeah.
Maybe the best time to be here. So this is what we got. We brought this to autumn. Cheers, gentlemen. Kanpai.
Cheers. Kanpai.
And I brought an akiagari from Ryusei, which is in Hiroshima, down Takehara. And the reason I brought it today was because Sebastien was so kind as to put me in touch with these folks when I was down there recently. And it was a place I'd been meaning to visit, and it was a lovely visit. And so I just recently brought this back with me, so this is a thanks to Sebastien as well. And it was a really lovely visit. And it was interesting to see because there was serious flooding down in Hiroshima just toward the end of summer. Some areas and some breweries suffered more than others. They took a really severe hit. Their brewing this year is actually going to be postponed by about a month. They're still in there cleaning out. They had mud and water, several inches deep all throughout the brewery and everything. Right. And so he was in there showing me the tanks. You could see the actual line on the tanks up to how far, the water was up in there. And so they're just cleaning furiously and trying to get everything all prepped. And so it was very much eye-opening as to exactly what happened there. Well, you don't see, the effects of that so much day to day, but it was also just a really lovely opportunity to visit the region in Takehara, because there's a number of really fantastic breweries out there as well, right in that region. And so, to go and troop around there and to chat with them for an afternoon kind of made my day.
I mean, Fuji-san is a specialist of Kimoto, of the Kimoto method for the yeast starter, so the traditional method, let's put it this way. It would deserve, again, a very long explanation, but one of the characteristics of this sake is the acidity that is very clear in this bottle that we have.
Yes. This mouth-watering kind of that you get at the end of the sake. It takes a little while to develop, but it's quite, powerful. That mouth-watering is definitely the presence of quite a high acidity, even for sake. And I mean, generally, sake has a lower acidity to say wine, but it's really mellow, isn't it? It's really mellow and really nice.
It's the flavor of happiness.
Yeah.
That's
and a good way of getting into our main topic today might be to talk a little bit about the event that we attended last month.
We did. That kind of ties into this Hiroshima sake that I brought with me as well too. Yeah, we had the toji from Taketsuru.
Yes.
Ishikawa-san.
200 meters away from Fuji Shuzo.
Yeah, they're very close. Yeah, and that's tying back into what I was talking about our sake today. Fuji Shuzo is what I brought. They're right in that same neighborhood in Takehara.
Yes.
And so I did stroll by and peek in the other day, but that was a rather mind-blowing and inspiring. Really, really inspiring. He's an excellent speaker. What was it that was so inspiring, Chris?
Well, everything I thought I knew about sake was completely blown up. It was completely turned over like a boat, capsized, basically. In that kind of one presentation that he gave, a lot of it's quite kind of obvious when you think about it. But the way they were taught in textbooks and all the information that's out there, just turns out to be not wrong, but kind of told in a different way. There are other sides to that story which he brought out, and the one thing that strikes me in particular is I was taught that sake brewing is better. The kind of the environment is more suited for sake brewing if it's a colder environment, right? And the first thing
is what they tell you.
That's what they tell you. And the first thing he said was, so what do you think of when you think of a sake environment? You think of cold temperatures. But the fact is that, lactic acid bacteria, which is essential in brewing, shuts off, below zero, around about 0 degrees. What did he say? If you put a yogurt in the fridge, you're trying to make yogurt and you put it in the fridge, it just completely halts the...
It doesn't, exactly. Yeah. You have to leave it out in more of a warmer temperature, exactly.
Right. I mean, how did you feel about that, Justin? Were you kind of surprised by that? Or?
Yes and no. Yes, in that it was, you don't hear a lot of folks just kind of come out and say it. But if you sort of look at just sort of the way a lot of those microorganisms work, it makes perfect sense. And when you really start digging back and you start looking at sake production, a lot of the education that's built up around sake and a lot of the things that people focus on nowadays tend to be sake of the last 100 years or so, tends to really take a focus as to what are the standards. Because a lot of the education, a lot of the information is really trying to emphasize quality as well, and quality standards today are a lot different than kind of what they used to be. And so when you start looking at that, a lot of the education tends to be built up around that and sort of the circumstances around that. But when you look back, we've been making sake for a long time before not only there was refrigeration and all these fancy tools and all those things for cooling and temperature control and all this, but there was also the systems and the work systems and time frames and for how people work. So when they talk about brewing typically being done in the winter, well, I said that wasn't so much for temperature control and for controlling fermentation. It was more out of a convenience for how do we get, once we started shifting to a larger scale and more people, more production happening, needing more manual labor, and then having to get who can do that? Rice farmers when they have time off in winter and they come in. So it was more of a convenience on the production side as things started to scale, as opposed to in order to make better sake.
That's what you thought. And then he was like, well, actually, the real reason why they started brewing in the colder season is because it was a tax thing, right? It was the government, the Bakufu, just said, we'd rather you produce the new sake in the around the winter. We'd rather you brew in the winter, because they were brewing in the summer months, basically. They were releasing the Shinshu in did you say August, was it? September or something like that? Wow. I mean, I never heard that. I mean, it's just, mind-blowing. I mean, I went and did quite a lot of research after that, and there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I said, and when I started, without going down another kind of rabbit hole, but he talks about, they tend to focus on that Kimoto style as well, and a lot of the education around that, it tends to focus on, you have to do this in order to get these microbes going and to get all that working for you. Previously, it actually wasn't a problem. It was actually developed in order to solve the problem of, now we have to brew in the winter.
Yes.
How do we get these working for us again? As opposed to, we came up with this new technique in order to make this happen. It was more, we've actually been doing this for many, 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 many years.
Right.
Because we were brewing under conditions that that supported this sort of microbial action that was necessary. And the shift to winter actually forced them to go, how are we going to do this now?
Exactly.
Which is really
so interesting. And then, of course, I guess the convenience with the Toji thing was just that. It was just a pure convenience. It was just really lucky that the guys who had the best kind of, expertise when it came to the rice. They knew the most about the rice. They understood the rice better than the original brewers, just happened to be available in that season.
So, yeah, so that was really great.
And that's where it starts, right? So it starts in around about the Edo period, or maybe a little bit earlier, with this kind of switch to winter brewing, for whatever reason, And
what a great sake, by the way.
Yeah, it is.
It's warming up, and you've got
is.
all these, for me, late summer aromas coming up, like fields, late summer fields.
And it gets better and better as we're sort of talking about this brewing and this kimoto and all this. It just kind of gets more and more tasty as we go.
Yes.
We'll have to find a way to share this with all of our listeners through our new
maybe we can
sniff filters that we're developing
sniff filter
for Instagram coming soon. So with that,
what is the state of the industry? Let's answer that question. So for our listeners out there, I mean, what is the state of the sake industry in Japan?
Generally unhealthy.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Would you agree with that?
I even want to be a little bit provocative and say that sake has almost become marginal in Japan. I mean, I see so many overseas visitors. It's my job, and of course, for them, sake equals Japan, Japan equals sake. But the reality is that sake today is a marginal drink if you look at the statistics of the National Tax Administration. It only represents about 6.5% of total alcoholic beverage consumption. That's just a little bit ahead of wine. Wine is 4.5. I mean, if I'm wrong by a couple of tens of percentage, don't hold me for that. But this is our starting point. I mean, there's been a 40-year long crisis in the sake brewing industry, and sake is trying to recover from sort of a marginal position.
And this might surprise a lot of people who have, for example, just recently visited Japan or are in Japan right now, going around all these amazing places that are offering these amazing sake experiences. I mean, sake is really up there in the kind of the ranking of things to do when you come to Japan. So why on earth are we talking about, it being an unhealthy industry? And of course, it needs some explaining.
As Sebastien was mentioning, because it's right, we're not at the end of, we're still continuing a 40-year decline. I'm thinking we might be starting to plane out maybe a little bit, possibly.
Well, John always says we might, like next year, we might kind of, move into the, start
the up curve.
The up curve. But
I think, the figure I'm looking at more precisely, or the more important figures I'm looking at is the production of premium sake.
Yes.
And whereas we can try to guess what the total sake production will do over next year, I mean, I have absolutely no doubt that premium sake production will go up. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say that, but continue to go up because it has gone up
already.
Or has been going up over the last few years. I mean, Chris, you were talking about these exciting sake tasting experiences you can have when you come to Japan. But again, most travelers to Japan are following the golden route. I mean, Tokyo, Kyoto, Hakone, Hiroshima, maybe a bit of Nara, a bit of Takayama, and we looking at it from our position as somebody living in Tokyo. I mean, I can say that whereas the Tokyo sake scene is extremely exciting. I mean, every time I go to, I don't know how to call it, but like to the regions, let's call it this way, you get a different picture about the sake market.
Absolutely, and you're touching upon. So you're looking at all the different types of alcoholic beverage in Japan and sort of the consumption, the percentage of those. Right. Sake is making up generally less than 7% of all of that. And the way I kind of like to explain it, and kind of a really easy way to picture, as Sebastien, as you were saying, everybody, especially not from Japan, who doesn't necessarily have an association with the close association with Japan, Japanese sake, it seems a given that sake is just part of the daily experience for a lot of people. As people imagine France, they imagine wine and sort of, they imagine Germany or someplace, they imagine beer or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, wine in France is more than 50% of
Right.
alcoholic beverage consumption.
And so the way I like to explain it kind of paints a really almost kind of a dire picture is imagine you go out to, a restaurant that, go out for dinner that seats, it's a restaurant that seats, 50 people. Of those 50 people, 3 or 4 of them are sipping sake. And,
True.
Whereas, if you were to go to France and go out to, somewhere for dinner, and if you went out there and didn't see a single person hardly consuming a glass of wine, you'd be disappointed.
You'd be wondering where you are.
You'd wonder where you are. Exactly.
Is there something wrong with the place?
Exactly. And so, and that's sort of the state of things. That's kind of what we're looking at, and we're kind of on this, the steady decline for a long time. And again, there's a number of reasons. There's a number of factors that goes into that.
But if we go back to the question is, until when was sake like it is, or wine is in France? Everyone was drinking it and it was really popular. And my understanding is that it was kind of the 70s was the peak here in Japan. So, at the 70s, the graph just starts going the opposite direction. And of course, then the question is why? So, why was that? And there are a number of different reasons for that, right? But what would you say? I mean, I would say change in food.
I would give a couple of things. Sebastien was looking to chime in.
Go.
Well, I mean, in a way, again, being a bit provocative, I'd say that I think the sake industry had lost a bit of its soul in this post-war period. And it already started before some of the reasons started before the war, actually. But sake was in high demand, and a lot of and industrial production really was ramped up after the war. And with wealth growing in Japan, people were drinking more and more alcohol, and there was sake, then beer, and other alcohol as well. But sake really was the main thing. But as you say, I mean, mid-70s, a couple of things happened. I think food has changed, and foods changed, and that's the time when Japan opened its borders to alcohols and spirits from the world.
Yes.
So I would say that 2 generations of Japanese consumers turned their back.
Yeah, I would say it was kind of a perfect storm of a number of things, in that you can't overlook the effects of the war. So a lot of people know, they ask me, they always talk about, they like to imagine that why does sake taste the way that it does? It's because it was crafted beautifully to match with Japanese cuisine and all these things. Actually, if you look back over time, why does sake taste the way it does, or why did it then? It was probably because of taxes or war. I mean, those 2 things had more effect on how sake was made and what was consumed than anything. And so when you look at, and one thing you really have to remember, the difference between this is sake and wine that's really significant is, at the end of the day, if you don't have grapes, you're still gonna be okay.
Yeah.
Right? You're gonna be okay. You may not be as happy as you were before. He's trying to hold back. He's trying to hold back. But in Japan, if you don't have rice, you don't have anything, right? It's your staple. It is what you need. You're feeding an entire nation on this single staple. And so in times of hardship, right, when you have to get people fed who do not have food, who are not of health, when you have people who are going off to war and these different things, you do not have...
You don't prioritize
the freedom.
sake,
exactly.
right?
Your priorities change.
Prioritize your
but sake plays a really important part at the same time. So the solution is, okay, so how do we make more for less? And that's when you start seeing a lot of these different additives and these other different solutions for trying to create sake flavor-ish
And you
product.
mentioned tax, and I think tax is one of the massive, reasons as well, because so this was in the 70s. This was a long time before the invention of so-called premium sake, tokuteime shoshu, a special grade designation sake. They were still using the old tax system, so they were basically creating the sake. Yeah, I mean, just to for nothing more than basically the brewers were not inspired to make higher quality sake, because every time that whenever they made higher quality sake, they had to pay higher tax. And to the general public, it wasn't transparent enough about why certain sake cost more than others. So there was no motivation to create better quality sake. We were really just kind of stuck with the same quality of sake. And when you have that, you have no competition in the market. You have no diversity. right?
We have to look at, and things were sold much more locally in there as well
Yeah.
too, right? It wasn't a mass distribution. Right now, everything is sort of centered
Right.
around Tokyo and these large metropolises, and so there wasn't a need to market. Whereas you had a market that could consume locally and that you could
Yeah.
sell to.
I mean, I think there are plenty of factors contributing to the storm that we were
Yes.
describing. I think the agricultural land reform that was inspired by the U.S. government occupying Japan and U.S. administration occupying Japan, and but promulgated by the Japanese authorities, created a major disconnection between the sake brewing industry and the rice farmers. Most winemakers are wine growers, and in the case of the sake industry, it ceased to be the equivalent after the war, with brewers having to buy rice from a state-controlled
Yes.
cooperative. So basically, the clients of the rice farmers were the state cooperative,
That's
not the sake brewers.
The JA, right? We're going to talk about them.
It'll probably come up, if you hear.
Japanese agriculture.
So I think, lots of things. I mean, and the development of the mass media and the transportation and the logistics enabled sake to be moved around, facilitated the fact that sake brewers could sell their whole tanks that would be blend. And again, tax is an important factor that was for this kind of business decisions. But you had a number of brewers producing sake for a particular taste, and that tank would be sold and blended with another tank from another producer to create a certain type of taste.
And the real controversial reason, which I think we do have to touch upon, is the Toji system, right?
Before we sort of dig down that
Okay.
hole, 'cause that's gonna, so you kind of have all those things coming together, and then kind of as you guys were talking about, so we were talking about the peak being at the 70s. You got to remember sort of getting back to in that post-war period when you have, even though maybe the war itself only lasted a few years, right? That resonates for
Yes.
quite a while to come, right? And so you have a lot of these brewers that have been producing a very different sake than what sake had been before, but once there's no more market for something else, you're not forced to make something else anymore, right? And so there's not a market for it. And also it's a whole lot cheaper to make that type of sake. So that's all of a sudden becomes the standard. And you start making that type of sake. And then coming out of that, then Japan into the 70s, you get this big economic boom. And I think that's the other, the big, it's sort of that cross section between coming out of this long struggling period combined with this massive economic boost, which as just being a human, doesn't matter Japanese or anything, you're in that sort of a situation. You basically want all the things you didn't have or couldn't have before. And that at first it was, I think, a lot of the sake you didn't have before. So that's when you start seeing these ginjo and these daiginjo that start popping into the market, these things that were more costly that both cost-wise, resource-wise, as well as technology-wise couldn't be produced before. But then once you get to over that hurdle, then you want everything else that wasn't there before. And as Sebastien, as you mentioned, when it starts opening up to the world and all these other beverages, at the end of the day, the only direction for it to go was down.
Yes.
So when most, pre-war, when most all of the market was Nihonshu or, shochu or these things produced in Japan, all of a sudden you have this market that has the disposable income and the interests
and a changing diet.
And a changing diet and all these other things that you just want all the things you couldn't have before. And so when you have more availability and more education, more people traveling, all these things are able to get wine, they're able to get spirits.
This happened over a period of time. And we say it kind of peaked at the 70s, but obviously that doesn't mean an overnight slump, right? The slump happened over quite a long period of time. So the question is, why couldn't brewers kind of pull themselves out of this slump? And the answer is really just tradition. The way they'd been brewing all this time is really to have this, toji. And the toji's kind of recipe, the toji's way of making the sake. And kind of, it wasn't really normal for the brewers. That's the owners of the breweries, by the way, the families that own the breweries, who never really, they tended not to get involved with the brewing itself. And it would be very unusual for them to go to the toji and say, hey, the trend isn't what it was. Can you make us a different sake now? You just wouldn't do it, Well,
I guess what you're getting at there is not so much the presence of the toji that affected that, but the fact that marketing, sales, and production were completely separate entities within the same system,
right? So breweries were kind of agricultural livelihoods, these were people just trying to make a living. They weren't necessarily trying to make a global sake that was going to conquer the world or anything. There wasn't that desire at that time. They were just happy making a living, which is, and that's fine. But because they weren't business minded, I guess you're saying they didn't have the marketing knowledge or the business kind of knowledge to kind of get themselves out of this slump. Or, I do think that they were kind of, the tradition of sake brewing did restrict them a little bit, even if they wanted to kind of make that move. But yeah, it wasn't completely impossible, because some breweries did actually, try and get themselves out of this slump by targeting of the overseas markets, right? But the industry as a whole didn't kind of move. They needed to kind of move together, I think, really. If they'd moved together and change, and actually marketed sake in a different way very early on, then maybe, we wouldn't have had this kind of slump. But it is what it is. So, we're in a kind of, we're in a better situation now. Sake is growing in popularity, or as we've already said, premium sake is growing in popularity. So, okay, why? What's the reason for that? Why do we...
Well, it kind of gets back a little bit to, kind of getting back, sort of touching what you were talking about there and what Sebastien mentioned, but sort of a combination of the Toji system that you were getting into, as well as the farmland system you're getting into, is right. In order to change your situation, you have to have access to your raw materials, and you have to have access to your market. And the sake breweries essentially had neither for a long time, because of the way that agricultural system was reformed. It basically, for a long, long period of time, it eliminated their direct communication to and access to the raw materials. So what do we source? How do we source it? Pricing and all these different things become factors. Those weren't things they were able to tweak with, right? So they lost access to that, while at the same time not having access directly to the market. And so they were dependent upon other wholesalers and things like that, and other middlemen that were essentially selling to a pre-existing market. As the market changed, that didn't necessarily evolve along with the changing economy and the changing markets. And so when those things start happening, the breweries weren't in a position of power, nor did they have the experience or know-how in order to be, I guess you could say, in charge of their own destiny, I guess you could say.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
And I guess that's what has changed, it's still changing, but that is sort of what's changing, is in the process of changing, is producers re-examining access to the raw materials, as well as stepping it up in marketing and getting different product, sake to their consumer, and sort of being more aware of.
Another really important thing is the image that sake had, right? So, when I was learning about sake in London, I was, breweries coming from Japan would always tell me how in Japan sake was an old man's drink, right? It was something for kind of the middle generation upwards, like, in your 40s or 50s or whatever. And so I think one of the other reasons is for this kind of slump is that, sake had a bit of an image problem. And of course, in recent years, thanks to an influx of new blood, younger brewers, the next generation of Toji and the next generation of brewers, and brewery families that have actually started to get involved with the brewing themselves, right? Not rely on a Toji, but actually have their own offspring become Toji and take control of their own destiny, right? That's probably been the big kind of turning, the thing that has, enabled the industry to kind of recover in a way, at least as far as premium sake is concerned anyway.
Yeah, I think this change of generation has happened continuously. So it's not a new phenomenon. But a difference I see is that because of our times, some of the representatives of this new generation have had more chances to be exposed to other things than their fathers.
But you
being
say
traveling, traveling, getting interested in the wine industry and so on and so forth.
But the stories I hear, it's not like as though the brewers were inspired to do this right from the beginning. You hear a lot of the stories you hear. It's kind of like at first they had no interest in sake brewing whatsoever. They just went off to university. They had this opportunity which their ancestors never had, to go to university and to learn maybe business or marketing or something, or maybe not even that. Maybe just go and travel the world. And it's only when they come back home that, and maybe there's some kind of event or some trigger that inspires them to get back into brewing, but then they get back into brewing. It's not as if they ever had that desire to begin with.
Well, it's kind of getting back to sort of that marketing side. It's tough to, I think, for anyone to understand or appreciate exactly what makes your environment special if you don't have anything to compare that to, right? And so when you're looking at, up until then, there was no need to have to really think about marketing, these other different things. They probably never really had to also think much about the family business because it was just the family business. You grow up and you're just doing that all the time. You hear about it all the time. It's not something that is, pressing on you day to day so much. And so, but then without the experience, now that we're talking about these younger generations, they haven't experienced, the post-war struggles. They haven't experienced the economic rebirth that Japan went through. They don't have these other experiences in this other context weighing down their sort of preconceptions as to what people will go for, what the market will go for. Well, at the same time, they're going out, with fresh young eyes and getting experience, whether it's overseas or in other industries. And in doing that, they're able to see, again, from the outside, what resonates with people, not just in the world of sake, but what gets people excited about different things and what is really resonating with people. And now a lot of, as we're talking about sort of while overall production is going down, some of that quote unquote higher end sake, the Jumai Ginjo, is either planing or starting to see an up curve, is because you're seeing in general, around the world, much greater interest in food, a literacy around food and beverage and where these things are coming from and who's making them. And that awareness and getting out into the world and seeing that nowadays, again, we also have all these resources available to us, whether it's social media or these other tools, where we have very direct access to what are people responding to. And so you have these younger generations who are actually going out and seeing that and going back home and going, everything I had at home is the type of thing that the entire world is responding to right now. There's a whole lot that can be done. This is actually a really innovative industry as opposed to just a really traditional industry.
Coming back to the expression I was using, actually, soul is coming back into sake brewing.
And I think breweries in general have become much more friendly towards their audience. I hope that's not too controversial, but I think they've learned to kind of speak to their audience. Yeah. So there are breweries that, like popular music, like rock music. So they put a rock music thing on their label, and that appeals to people who like rock music. It's a simple marketing trick, but it really works. There's breweries that love anime. And so they have an audience that likes anime as well. And they target their audience by putting anime characters on the label. I think this has been key to, and getting that next generation of drinkers interested in sake has been key. Now, the question is, will they continue to go on drinking sake until they're in their 30s or 40s? If they do, and they inspire the next generation of drinkers, then I think we can look at this quite positively.
I do think that sake has, or Nihonshu, and shochu as well, actually, have a great card to play. Is because they got their soul back, because they got their story back. They have they have a lot of potential to regain market share. And for me, that's the big hope, is that their stories will, the stories of this younger generation, the stories of the sake brewers in general, will attract consumers back to sake and basically take them away from other less interesting drinks. But we shouldn't forget that one of the reasons why consumers are looking at these less interesting drinks and have these mixed cocktails in mind, so the addition of distilled alcohol to carbonated water with citrus aromas, is economics, is revenues. Sake is cheap today if you compare it to other alcoholic beverages in other parts of the world, and this is great because it makes our life.
It's a really good time to get into sake. This is what I always recommend to people: get into sake now. The next 10 years are going to be glorious. 10 years from now, you could be, if everything goes according to plan, you'll have to pay a whole heck of a lot more for a lot more diversity and a lot more high quality sake. You'll probably have to be dipping into the well. So
I really hope that these consumers are going to leave Chuhai, starting with my mother-in-law, and get back into Nihonshu. But I must say, economics is one factor, and it's going to keep a lot of pressure on sake prices for a while.
Yeah, and then getting back to sort of where do people buy sake? Then becomes a big difference. So getting to those younger consumers.
There's been a huge change in the distribution of sake. I mean, back 20 years ago, most sake was distributed by specialized stores, Saketen, Sakaya, you call them as you want, and other places like supermarkets were really marginal. But today we see a sake distribution spread out across convenience stores, department stores.
Buy online.
And online platforms, and so on and so forth. But the difference I see in terms of the consumer's reasoning is, I mean, I would put the online platforms together with the specialized stores, because the consumer will walk in or log in with a specific ID in mind about what he wants to buy. So he's an amateur. Whereas supermarkets and convenience stores are, in general, but there are lots of exceptions, offering a small variety of not always very interesting sake. But if you look at the French market in wine, I'm sorry to get back to my roots, but French super and hypermarkets, they have developed their wine offer tremendously. And today not today, 20 years ago when I was in France, I was not ashamed going to a large supermarkets to buy my wine, because there was a great selection of the best as well as the cheapest.
I have to say, if you're in Japan and you want to buy sake and you don't know where to buy it, the department stores are a great place to go and buy sake.
The large
department stores, like there's one in Ikebukuro and Shibuya here, and they look after their sake very well, and they know, they're knowledgeable. They can, I don't know about guiding you in English, but they know their stuff, and
diverse selection.
They have a very diverse selection, yeah.
Sort of getting back to those numbers. So where is sake sold? So kind of going back over time. So we're talking about these sake specialty stores, these wholesalers that have been in charge of selling sake on the market. So a little over 20 years ago, those stores made up nearly 80% of all sake sales in Japan. A little over 10 years ago, that was 50%. It's now about 28%. So it's been halved about every 10 years. On the flip side, 20 years ago, convenience stores made up just over 10%. 10 years after that, they made up 25%, and now they make up nearly 35%, right? And then supermarkets have been sort of growing over time as well too, from about 4% up to 11%, and then now at about 12% or so. But between supermarkets and convenience stores, that are saying they make up about 50%, whereas those specialty stores make up only about a quarter now. But a lot of these small producers, all these places are still operating, still selling through those places. And what I didn't realize exactly how many of these sake specialty stores there were. So this data is from 3 years ago. But in Japan, there were about 46,000 of these stores. That's almost the same number of convenience stores in Japan. There's 54,000 convenience stores and 46,000 sake specialty stores, sake wholesalers. You would never know it walking around the streets. You would never. I didn't realize there were actually that many that were still.
I don't see as many sake specialist stores as I do convenience stores. Let's just put it that way.
Not nearly at all. And so that tells you the proportion. So you've got, it's second only to convenience stores, having about 46,000 operations. But as far as the number of sales, they make up, what am I looking at? 28%.
Because it's niche, right? Because it's niche products. And you have to know what they're selling. And most of these specialist sake stores, you really have to know what you're looking for. It's quite, what geeky is the right word?
Well, you've got both. So when you're looking at those places, you're looking at places that are, so the places that are quote unquote doing well are the places who are geeky.
Yes.
Or who have gone geeky, or have transitioned to geeky, or have, set up new operations. There are a lot of more, it's become a lot easier to get licenses to sell sake, to sell Nihonchu in Japan. So you've been seeing a lot more online retailers or smaller operations getting licensed, whereas those used to be very, very strictly guarded and restricted to get licensed to be able to sell Nihonchu, whereas there's much more easy to get now. So those places that are taking really good care of the producers, helping them market their sake to the restaurants and to the consumers for the current market as opposed to being reliant upon previous consumers and previous markets, previous restaurants and retailers and things like that. Those are the ones that, while the market isn't big, they're seeing the larger margins and they're developing good relationships with the producers. But there aren't 50,000 of those places in Japan. A lot of them are places that are just been kind of hanging on, and you'll walk in there and, a lot of them, the sake hasn't necessarily been cared for. It isn't necessarily selected. There isn't necessarily a super strong relationship with those producers. So it's, as with a lot of industries, you're starting to see this real distinct divide between really, really focused and then those who
and you know why that is? Because the liquor stores were in crisis, actually, are still in crisis. The ones that, same with the breweries, same as the breweries, the ones that haven't kind of marketed their way out have just folded. And they've had to, the ones that have survived have had to focus to survive. Because the general liquor store just disappeared. And the reason for that is because a lot of brewers started to not go through wholesalers, but started to sell direct and kind of pick and choose where they sold their sake, which is, good for the industry, but unfortunately it's not so good for these small liquor stores. Yeah.
There is one more figure I think we need to talk about, that people who know a bit about the wine industry can relate to, is the number of producers. Because we're actually dealing with a relatively small number of sake producers in Japan.
Incredibly small number, actually. When you start to put these things in.
Do we have that figure?
So I have, I've got some.
The number I have in mind is 1250, and the reason why we don't have.
I'm going lower. Let's play a game here.
The reason why we don't have a very precise number is because you can only count licenses, and some brewers don't produce; they just bottle. So some people keep their license, even though for the future. So it's difficult to know exactly. But take it or leave it. Let's say 1,200, 200.
I'm saying lower than that.
And,
okay,
and
just
actually, and I think maybe to people who aren't maybe familiar with wine or familiar with beer or familiar with those markets, you hear, "Gosh, there's more than 1,000 producers." It sounds like a lot, on the smaller nation. But if you put them in perspective, the region in Japan that has the most number of sake producers would be Niigata.
Yes.
And I don't know exactly the number, but it's going to be like 88 to 90.
Imada-san's nodding. So is it 90? 90, yeah. Okay.
About 90?
90, okay.
How many producers, for example, are there in a small wine producing region in France, for example?
There are about 90,000 wine producers in France, I think.
Just in France, right?
So it's a very different industry.
Because you have this system in wine, right? Where the winery doesn't necessarily produce the end wine, and they might just be growing the grapes. So how many, if you were to compare directly with a brewery, which is essentially one unit that grows, well, doesn't always grow their own rice, but they produce the end product. So how many is it that are actually producing the end product, right from the...
Well, it's not even really a comparison, because a lot of the places still aren't growing their own rice for sake and stuff as well either, right? That's kind of a recent development as well to be doing that. So, but still, just looking at the numbers, even these small areas, it's a completely different scale, and 90 is a lot. Most places aren't up there. I would say on average, if you put them all together in averages, you're probably looking at an average of maybe 40 to 50. Places on the high end being in 90 being sort of extreme, the other high ends being more in like the 60s or so, with the low end being down in the teens.
I think that's just the way that the industry has been controlled in Japan. It's not like anyone can just kind of buy a brewery and start brewing sake. I think it's a much stricter, strictly controlled industry. But the point is that, so 1,000 sounds like a large number, but the point is that at the end of the Second World War, there was around 4,000 breweries. So we've lost 3/4. We only have a quarter left, basically. That's how big that slump was.
That's the reality.
Yeah.
That is the reality that we're looking at. But getting back to sort of the positive side that you were getting before, is we are, because of sort of the nature of the industry, when you are in this position of survival, it's kind of, what do we do? It's either it's kind of, screw it. Let's go for it. Because a lot of places, they might be at the end, for the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, they could have been in the red for a decade. And how long they'll be able to continue this? Don't know. So it's time to sort of pick up those drastic measures. So they're starting to look to other outside investment, to bring in more strategic marketing, these other different things in order to.
There are a number of breweries where which are barely profitable or not profitable. And one of the reasons why they survive is because they have other businesses, real estate. I mean, a number of owners, brewery owners, where their agricultural land was confiscated in this agricultural land reform, but they were given some real estate, some land in return near cities and stuff. So you have a number of brewers who are making revenues through real estate, and whereas the history connects them with sake. Sake today is definitely ancillary to their business, and that's one of the reasons why it can. Some of these businesses are surviving, which is a ray of hope. But the other side of looking at it is maybe some of these 1,200 breweries are not focusing enough on their sake brewing business.
Yeah, but I think, like, to understand that, you really have to talk about the economics of a brewery. So, like, why are these breweries kind of in such a fragile situation to begin with? Yes, they do have this land, they have these assets, but brewing is basically, you buy the rice, and that, in a sense, that becomes kind of like your debt, right? And you have to pay that debt off. So you have to produce sake one way or another. Whether it's good sake or bad sake, you have to do something with that rice to be able to pay the farmers back, right, originally. And most of the time, brewing was just happy with, most breweries were just happy with being able to pay off this rice debt, and if they were able to make any more than that, well, obviously that was a nice little bonus. But, realistically, most breweries just cover this original debt. And of course, because of the way that they used the rice harvested the year before to make the sake, when they release the sake, it's the next year. It's kind of, this debt is always, it's kind of retrospectively, you have to look at it, right? This debt, it's not that year's debt, it's the year before. I think that's what makes brewing so difficult. The economics, I think, are really important. Maybe the economics need to change so that, breweries can produce sake with a little bit more stability. I don't know. The breweries that have innovated and kind of, targeted overseas are maybe making a little bit more from overseas sales, for example.
And so when we talk about these innovative breweries, and they are super innovative, and they're doing stuff, but it's still a small number in the large scheme of things. But the nice thing is now, because of, so kind of shifting to a positive focus, we've been kind of going for a long time, getting back to the ideas of events and that communication, the types of things these places are doing, is that as the number of producers decrease, and these people are, and these producers are in a bit more dire situations, they become much more proactive, become much more experimental, become much more open to new ideas and experimentation. And you're really starting to see that, not just in the communication of the product, but the product itself, the relationship with farmers, the relationship with consumers. And that's just happening all across the spectrum here in Japan right now. And so if you, right now, honestly, just in the last 5-10 years, if you are into sake and you have access, sadly, a lot of the information as to what types of places are having dinners and having events and all that stuff still isn't available in, different languages for a lot of people out there. That would be a great business for somebody to do, is to just start collecting sake information, start putting that out there, because there's a lot of great stuff out there. But it's very uplifting to go out and see the work that these producers are doing, the relationships, not just with farmers, but also with other brewers, with other producers. It's becoming a lot more collaborative. There's a lot more information sharing. The level of quality and diversity has just been going up. As in the communications around that, whether it's packaging and marketing at these small, at these direct markets, or the types of events and the way that those are put together, that's just become really, really, really exciting. There's still a lot more room to grow as well, too. There's a lot more to do there. Yeah,
and the situation is hard, but again, the reason why we are excited about being in the industry is because we see all these developments going on and promising, and all these new projects, all these are actually showing us, lead to an anticipation of a much brighter future.
Absolutely. I said it's inspiring. It's like, see, while you still have, the nice thing is that while you still do have that the span of generations in there, and a lot of the solutions they're looking toward, when you were talking about marketing, you're looking at production stuff, they're looking at newer, more quote unquote innovative solutions. But a lot of times those innovative solutions are taking hints from what was actually done in the past, because a lot of these breweries, it's always been kind of moving forward. It hasn't been it didn't build in Japan. It didn't really build up under this different market segments. It was in a very, very singular type of market that all of the sake production and styles and all these things grew out of. This is maybe, again, I wasn't around 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago, but this is maybe and quite likely the first time that you've ever seen such diversification in sort of the styles of sake. And that's coming not just through quote unquote new innovation, but also going back and looking at tradition and those more quote unquote traditional styles of
it's a
production.
Mix of modern and old, isn't it?
And
it's remarkable how breweries have managed to hold on to their tradition.
And this is a younger, you're talking about the younger generation.
Yes.
This is a younger generation that's appreciating that in a way that maybe
The older generation didn't.
yeah,
Or
that
they
maybe
took it for
did, or
granted. They
it's
took it for
manifesting
granted.
itself in a different way, I think.
Yeah.
And so that's being communicated to more people. And I think the market is ready for that too. And so
Yeah.
because the market is ready for that and looking for that, it's becoming a lot more fun for everybody.
They're kind of rediscovering how cool those traditions were, I think. It's kind of like they were taken a bit for granted in the past, and now this younger generation is looking at for them and like things like Kimoto and Yamahai and Kyoki Jikomi and going, hey guys, take out that wooden tank and that wooden barrel and start making sake in it, because that's cool, you know? And that's great because that really adds diversity.
With that, I think we will wrap up this one. How about for you gentlemen, for anyone who is interested in finding more information about what you two are up to, where can listeners find more information about both of you?
So, I mean, being involved in sake tourism and the promotion of sake culture, I run a modest blog, which is my name, Sebastien Lemoine.wordpress.com, and you will see some articles, some posts which are related to what we discussed today.
Hopefully by the time this podcast goes up, it will be up. I'm working on a website and the address is decided and everything. It's www.sake, tabi, T-A-B-I, bito, B-I-T-O. So it's sakenotabibito.com.
Excellent. And you can find me at Potsuke, www.pots/k.com. And I'm on the Instagrams and the Twitters and that stuff. So if you just kind of poke around there, I'm floating around. A big thank you to Frank behind the boards here today for making us sound lovely and putting us all together. To Imada-san, who has been our voice of reason in the corner that we can always turn to. And with that, we're all finished up. Thank you. For more information on us, so social medias and things like that, you can find Sake on Air at Sake on Air on both Instagram and Twitter. If you have questions, we would love to get your questions, show ideas, feedback, things like that. Again, we are just getting started here. We've got a lot to learn. We're trying to figure this out as we go. So we want to know what you are interested in, what excites you, what was confusing, what was inspiring. You can reach us at questions@sakeonair, all one word, .com. And
Thank you very much, Justin.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much to the Sake and Shochu Makers Association for helping make this possible, and to this lovely place here that we call the Japan Sake and Shochu Information Center, where we get to come and sip tasty beverages and chat with our listeners.
Yes.